Quick question, Rabbi.
Yeah. Let us continue the sort of the historical trajectory of, but very briefly, we spoke about the Midrash Halacha, very briefly about the Mishnah, but that understanding of how the Mishnah was multi-layered and maybe stitched together was missing in the Talmudic approach to the Mishnah, because more in the Babylonian Talmud than in the Yerushalmi Talmud. The Talmud splits into sort of two branches, the one of Eretz Yisrael and the one of Babel. The rabbis of Eretz Yisrael were aware of the difficulties in putting all the material of the Mishnah together, so they did not sanctify the text in the same manner. They did not go after each word to say, that's the only way that it can be understood. It must be there for a reason, in the way that people refer to the text of the Torah, which even that is questionable, and we'll have to go back to it. You know how every rabbi who comes to give a speech would start by saying, we all know that there's not one word in the Torah that's not there, that is not there for a reason. And if the rabbis of the Mishnah would have heard him, they would get very upset. They would definitely disagree with him. But the problem is that was the same rule was applied later on to each and every layer of our halachic and in general the Jewish literature, to say, each letter, each word here is written with divine inspiration, and therefore it's measured and metered, and you could learn something from it. So the Talmud Bavli goes more with that mentality, unless it comes to a dead end where he says, Mehaleka lemelaf mina. This Mishnah is you cannot infer from it other things. That's how it's written. That's what it is, and that's it. But the Talmud Yerushalmi would go differently, and later on we'll see that the question even of how the Bavli was edited, and was it edited? Today the Talmud Bavli has been sanctified as the ultimate source of halacha, but we are allowed to ask questions. We have to ask questions on the process within the Talmud. And there are several main issues that we have to look at. One is that we have this dark period in our history, not dark in the sense of evil or negative, but obscure, where we have about 200 years of anonymous authors working on the Talmud without us having an accurate way to measure their input. Unlike a text where you know exactly where the author stepped, what is the author, and what is an extrapolation, and what was added in by later generations. There were, between the time of the Babylonian Talmud and the Geonim in Babel, there were about 200 years or 150 years of the activity of the rabbis called Savoraim, that for many, many centuries people argued were just that, Savorai, from the word Svara, assumption or argument, and they were just having ideas about the Talmud, but they didn't write anything down. It is very hard, even without having the textual evidence, it would be hard to argue that you have hundreds or dozens of rabbis even that are active for about 150 years with the Talmudic text without making any impact. It is literally impossible. If you look at the rabbinical world today, everyone who can write something writes something, and not only rabbis, even Baalei Batim. I go to synagogues and I see a book by the president of the synagogue. I say, wow, amazing! I didn't know that the president is such a Talmid Chacham. And then you look at the back, written in collaboration with this rabbi, whatever. People have this need to be involved and to write something. But the Savorim really had maybe this tremendous humility or reverence to the rabbis of the Talmud. So instead of changing it or either that, or they had this awareness of the collective, of what today is called the hive brain, or the moach kaveret in Hebrew. They use this term a lot. So they worked on details as a group, and that's what we find in the Talmud as Tana Devei this, Tana Devei Rav Shila, the students of this Beit Midrash sometimes, or it just appears anonymously. But here also, it's important to have a comprehensive outlook of the Talmud. If you study the whole Talmud, if you do it several times and you really dig into the language, at a certain point you come to realize there is a different slang or a different language used by the Tanaim that we know by name of the first couple of generations of Tanaim and those who came later, and that is the telltale sign of later addition into the Talmud. This is just one of the problems that we have a lot of anonymous material that is sunk into the Talmud, and we're not aware of it. There's another problem, and that is a problem that came later on, and that is a problem of the copying of the Talmud. The whole material was transmitted from generation to generation as a manuscript. It was not printed. So every scribe would sometimes take the liberty to correct the text. And just as with non-Jewish literature, the great danger was when the scribe was somewhat learned. If you have an unlearned scribe, someone who's just a copying machine, he doesn't understand the text, so he could make a mistake with a word, with a letter, but he's not going to go beyond that. But if someone who has a certain understanding of the text might end up correcting more what he thinks is a correction, but altering the text. I'll give you an example of that. Not a real example. More, it's more a joke, but it highlights like the dangers here. And at a certain point in the 11th, 12th century, Rabbeinu Tam actually made a decree to not correct manuscripts. He says you're not allowed to correct any text within the text, only on the margins, even though he himself continued to do it in the text, because he did have the authority. So the story is about a man who borrowed a volume of the Talmud from his friend, and the friend, who knew that the borrower is not such a learned man, he said, "I'll give you my Talmud under one condition. I don't want you to don't make any corrections to the text." So the borrower was studying the Mishnah. There's a Mishnah Masechet Shabbat that speaks about someone who was planning to travel outside town on Shabbat. So he put his eruv on one side to allow him to travel, let's say, to the north. But then the reason for which he wanted to travel, it was a guest speaker was coming to town. He came to the south, they say. So the Mishnah says, Hareze Hamar Gamal. This man became a Hamar Gamal, meaning that he cannot go either way. What is this term Hamar Gamal? Hamar is a donkey driver. Gamal is a camel driver. The difference between them, that the donkey driver goes behind the donkey driver goes behind the donkey, and the camel drivers go ahead of the. So this guy is Hamar Gamal. He's stuck between, going back and forth. He doesn't know where to go. The borrower didn't understand the term, so he corrected it to write Hareze Hamor ben Gamal. So, which of course is not the original intention. The lender, where he got back the book and he leafed through it and he got to the point, he says, okay, not only you made a correction, you wrote your name and your father's name, and this is not right. Of course, it's like I think an extreme story, but I worked with manuscripts from mainly from the not the Genisa, but I worked with the 10th, from the 10th to the 12th, 15th century manuscripts, and I saw this a lot where people corrected. People would open the scribe would open acronyms, abbreviations, and they were not always correct. So that is one problem. The other problem was the not just corrections, but that the corrections would make their way into the text, and that is what we call sugyot mu'takot, sugyot kfulot, meaning that, let's say I study my copy of Talmud, right? It's manuscript, and a certain concept strikes me as important, and I say, I learned the same thing in, let's say I'm learning now Shabbat, I learned the same thing in Kiddushin. So I write to myself a commentary, right? Look up that, but before the printing press, there were no pages. There were no pages numbers, or so it would differ from manuscript to manuscript. So I could make a reference in Masechet Shabbat chapter this and that, or if I would be more methodical, I would copy the text which is relevant to my comment, and I would write it in the margins. But the next generation, either after I died or someone borrowed my Talmud and he says, let me copy that, and he copies that and says, here's an entry on the side, let me copy it into the text, and then it becomes part of the text. So an example of that you also find Masechet Kiddushin, where the Mishnah, the Talmud speaks about forced marriage. It's called Talyu v'Zabin, Talyu v'Kadish. If someone was hung from a tree, not from the neck, from his feet, right? Meaning he was threatened, and he either married a woman under threat, or sold his land under threat. Okay, I just realized that the audio video recording was paused. I'm sorry. At least we have audio. So this we're resuming the video recording, but this discussion appears originally in the Talmud in Masechet Kiddushin, but then every time this is mentioned in other places, not only this phrase is mentioned, but the whole Talmudic discussion that follows, and that creates problems, because we say, okay, how does it belong here? It doesn't belong here. That's Sugiyat HaMortar. So we have problems of copying, of editing, and sometimes we have just an additional problem of foreign words that can be found in the Talmud that not always were understood by the next generation. It is known that in order to be able to conduct a conversation in a language, in a foreign language, I've not known, but this is what people, more or less what the popular wisdom is, you need 1,000 words. With 1,000 words, you could conduct a conversation in another language. So in the Babylonian Talmud, there are thousands of words in foreign languages, Greek, Latin, and Persian, and same thing in the Yerushalmi Talmud. So we have thousands of words that each, this corpus of words by itself is a language that you don't understand. If you don't know the exact meaning of each word, you wouldn't know what the halachic implication of that word. So if the Talmud, for example, in Masechet Shabbat, speaks about knots that you're allowed or not allowed to tie on Shabbat, and brings an analogy, he says, this is the knot that you're not allowed to tie on Shabbat, is the same knot as is used in the Iskaria. What is Iskaria? So it's a Greek word, which was not understood by the time the Talmud used it. It was just by tradition, by hearsay, and nobody knew what the word meant. So we ended up with the conclusion that a durable knot is a double knot. You're not allowed to tie a durable knot on Shabbat, and meaning a knot that will not be opened again. So if you know a little bit about the halachot of Shabbat, you know that this has an relevance to how you tie your shoelaces, how you tie garbage bags. Even at a certain point, before you had the disposable diapers that you could open and the stickers would open and reopen. There were only one time. People said that this also is under the prohibition of tying, and this really complicates people's lives. Professor Daniel Sperber, who was my teacher in Bar Ilan, did the research on that. I mean, he did research on many, many things. Minhagei Israel, I highly recommend reading this book, as well as all of his other books. Is one book called Nautica Talmudica. This really was interested in the naval vessels and the way they were built in the time of the Talmud. And since he, besides Hebrew, he also is conversant in Greek and Latin. I don't know who he's conversing with, but he knows those languages. So he did the research on this on these words, and he also on the word eskalia, and he came to the conclusion that this word has been distorted. It was originally estokeraya, which means the ring of the mast's ring. And it's what is called hapex legomena. It's a word that was preserved only one place in the Talmudic literature, but this is the word. So what does it mean? It's a ring made of rope, and it was used in ancient vessels to pull the rope that raises the sails. And since if you ever seen a sail ship, there are many sails. It's a complicated system of ropes and rings and all that. What are the rings made of? If they are made of wood, the wood splinters in the with the salt water, with the change of weather, and metal would turn rusty. And so when you pull from where you're standing on the ship on the deck, and you pull the rope through it, it will cut the rope. The best material to use would be rope itself, because it is made of many small fibers which could expand and extract without damaging the rope. So the sailors would make this knot and turn the rope into a ring and put it up the mast. And you know how long this would stay there? Probably 20, 30 years. That makes sense to say, here's a kesher shel kayama, here's a durable knot that you should not do on Shabbat. Not shoelaces, not tying the bucket in order to lower it into the well to draw water, but the lack of knowledge of the language. This is what they call lexicography. Understanding the language is imperative to understand Talmud. So this is just some of the problems that we have with the Talmud. When we go to the Talmud Yerushalmi, it becomes even more complicated, because at a certain point there was a struggle over the hegemony, over control of the Jewish world. Who is going to be the center of power? It had to be, just like today, being the rabbi, being the head of the bedin, the head of the yeshiva. It is l'shem shamayim for many people, but for others it's a question of money and control and power. And there was a struggle for power between the yeshivot in Babel, the yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael. So the yeshivot in Babel conducted a campaign against the yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael, conveying the message that the Torah of Eretz Yisrael is Torah Shmad. It's the Torah of persecution. It's under the Christian control. They can't learn. They don't know the halacha well. You cannot rely on their rulings. And as a result, Yerushalmi was pushed aside to the extent that at a certain point there was no living tradition on how to study the Talmud. And because there was no living tradition, the text became more and more distorted and more difficult to understand, and was largely abandoned by the majority of Torah scholars. The one interesting exception that unfortunately we know of only through the Geniza, in the Kera Geniza, several pages were found of a book called Piskei Yerushalmi, rulings based on the Yerushalmi Talmud, written by none other than Maimonides. So, and for those who care about Maimonides and studies halacha, it tells a lot, because he has his own way that not always is in line with the Talmud. They're actually the bulk of the work of the brisk yeshivot is to try to reconcile Rambam with the Talmud Bavli, and not necessarily this is what he had in mind. So this we just got to the period of the Geonim, and while I'll talk about it later, I want to go now for a while to discuss the Midrash Halacha, because this is as the sort of the first source that I mentioned that we have of interpretation of the biblical text. And what Shuki asked before is where did the rules come from? Were they accepted by all? Were they formulated by the rabbis? How would they expand? So here we have one famous story that sheds light on this whole issue. And I recommend, we're probably not going to finish studying today. If you could go and if you're interested, I can email you the file. If not, you just look at Daf Samich Vav in Talmud Bavli, Samich Vav Amud Aleph, in Masechet Psahim, and in Talmud Yerushalmi in chapter 6. So here's the thing. Here's the text. Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva, כל מלאכה שאפשר לעשותה מערב שבת אינה דוחה את השבת. שחיטה שאי אפשר לעשותה מערב שבת דוחה את השבת. Rabbi Akiva, this is in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva stated the following rule. Any work which could be done before Shabbat does not override Shabbat. But shechita, slaughtering, which cannot be done on Erev Shabbat, overrides Shabbat. And this, of course, applies at the day where there was no refrigeration. You had to do shechita on the date. But this could be also a problem with shechita, slaughtering, that has to be done on a specific date. So we look at the Gemara, and the Gemara says the following: Tanur Rabbanan. It's in the source from a Baraita, an external Mishnah. Halacha zo nit'alma b'nei Betera. This law was forgotten by the sons of Betera, who were the heads of the Bedin. פעם אחת חל 14 להיות בשבת, שכחו ולא ידעו אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו. One time, the 14th of Nisan fell on Shabbat, meaning Pesach was on Sunday, and the 14th of Nisan was on Shabbat. שכחו ולא ידעו אם פסח דוחה את השבת אם לאו. And they didn't know whether the slaughtering of the Pesach, of the Paschal lamb, overrides Shabbat or not. Already here is an extremely important message that I could tell you that was completely ignored when I studied that in yeshiva. None of my rabbis stood up and said, can you believe that the heads of the Sanhedrin didn't know the halacha? They forgot whether the Pesach overrides Shabbat or not. This should freak us out. Really. Just this phrase should freak everyone out. Like, we are now learning halacha, ruling halacha, based on the knowledge in the Talmud and the Mishnah, where the Mishnah tells us, here you have a major concept and a major junction in the Jewish calendar, Pesach on Shabbat, and you don't know whether it overrides Shabbat or not. And it's not that it didn't happen for 100 years, because as we'll see later, this was something that was alive in the memory of the people. But the rabbis didn't know whether you could Pesach override Shabbat or not. What is their dilemma? The dilemma is as follows: we don't slaughter animals on Shabbat, but in the temple there are sacrifices, and sacrifices are brought on Shabbat. How so? That's very simple. When it's a public sacrifice that is brought by the Kohanim as representative of the community, the Torah made the exception that you could bring it on Shabbat. But a private sacrifice is not brought on Shabbat. So very, very simple distinction. Public sacrifice can be brought on Shabbat. Private sacrifice cannot. Now, what is Pesach? Is it private? Is it an individual sacrifice? Or a public sacrifice? On one hand, it's individual because each household does its own sacrifice. On the other hand, it's public because everybody does it on the same day, more or less at the same time. So is it public or private? Amru, so those Bnei Betera, the presidents, say, Klum yesh adam sheodea im Pesach docha et Shabbat im lav. Do we have here anyone who knows whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not? This today would be called, what they did, we would refer to it as crowdsourcing, right? They turn to the people in the temple and they say, does anyone here know the answer? Amru lahem adam echad yesh sha'alayim. There's a man here who came from Babylonia, his name is Hillel, and he served under the two great rabbis, Shemaiah and Avtalion, and he knows whether Pesach overrides Shabbat or not. Shalhu v'karulo, they called him and asked the question, and he said, is it only one Pesach that overrides Shabbat? We have more than 200 Pesachs which override Shabbat. They said, how do you know that? Amar lahem ne'emar mu'ado bePesach ve'ne'emar mu'ado betamid. The word mu'ad, on time, is mentioned regarding Korban Pesach, and it's also mentioned regarding the daily Korban, which is also brought on Shabbat. Ma mu'ado ha'amur betamid docha et Shabbat, af mu'ado ha'amur bePesach docha et Shabbat. Just as the the tamid, the daily korban, overrides Shabbat, and the word mu'ayyad is mentioned there, so also Pesach. Meaning is, it seems like he just uses the similarity of the words to derive the halacha. Ve'od kal v'chomer hu. He says it's a fortiori, meaning if the halacha applies in a weaker case, even more so in a stronger case. He says, Uma tamid she'en anush karet duchay et Shabbat, Pesach she'anush karet en odin she'duchay et Shabbat. Says the daily korban, if you don't bring it, you're not going to be punished by death. But if you don't bring the korban Pesach, you're going to be punished by death by the divine court. So obviously it should override Shabbat. So he started teasing them and saying to them, it says, Miyado shivu barosh uminu nasi aleim. They immediately submitted themselves, subjected themselves to him, and said, you are going to be the nasi, you're going to be the head of the bedin. And he started teasing them, saying, why did you not know the halacha? Because you were lazy, because you didn't learn under the two great sages, Shmaya v'Avtalion, which, in the way we know Hillel, it doesn't fit, but okay, that's another problem. And then they asked him this question, Rabbi, shachach v'lo hevi sakin me'erev Shabbat ma'u? What if I forgot to bring a knife erev Shabbat? Could I carry it on Shabbat? He said, I heard it, but I forgot it. Let's see what the people do, because if they're not prophets, they are the sons of prophets. And so on the following day, people brought the knife by attaching it somehow to the animal, either through the wool of the lamb or the horns of the goat. And he saw the act, and you remember the halacha. He says, this is what I've learned from Shmaya and Avtalion. So that's the story, how it appears in the Babylonian Talmud. There are many. I want you to review it. I mean, maybe next week we'll talk about that. But there are many things that we see here. First, that the rabbis forgot the halacha. They didn't know what to do. When the people still knew what to do, so it was still live in recent memory. And it seems, according to the story, that they had tremendous respect to Hillel. They brought him up. They asked him, what do you know? And he was able to convince them by using methods of midrash halacha. This is what Shuki was referring to before. He used the concept of kal v'chomer. He used the concept of binyan av. A logical comparison of texts and trying to arrive at a logical deduction. But if we go to the Talmud Yerushalmi, there's a different story. The Mishnah clearly says, Elu dvarim bepesach dochin et Shabbat shechitato. It is not mentioned as an obscure halacha, but rather as a very clear text codified in the Mishnah. And that shows, like, the Mishnah here predates the destruction of the temple. The Shechita of Pesach overrides Shabbat. And that is when Pesach, when the 14th of Nisan falls on Shabbat. So the same thing as in the Talmud Bavli, they say they didn't know the halacha, they didn't know what to do. But here's the difference. In the Yerushalmi, in the Babylonian Talmud, when they ask, does anyone know? The answer is, Adam echad yesh she'ala mi Babel. There's a man here who came from Babel. His name is Hillel the Babylonian. He served under the two great scholars, and he knows the answer. Here, they say, Amru yesh kan Bavli echad. Oh, there's this Babylonian guy. It's already like in a not degrading, but not very respectful manner. Oh, yesh kan Bavli echad. It's not Adam. It's just a. And they say, Efshar sheyesh imenu tohelet. Maybe we could get something from him. That is the real. That's where the real nature of the relations between the Babylonians and the Israelis come out, because the people of Eretz Israel did not like. They even despised the Babylonians. There were cases where people migrated from Babylon to Israel and they were punched and beaten. And the word Babylonian by itself became a derogatory term. So they're not very happy that they have to rely on Avtalion. Shalhu v'karu lo, amru lo, shamarta miyamecha. They said, did you ever hear what is the rule? In the Babylonian, if you see, they say, amru lo klum ata yodea, do you know? But in the Yerushalmi, they say, shamarta miyamecha. The difference between do you know on your own accord, or in the Yerushalmi, did you hear? Do you have a tradition on that? So the same thing as in the Yerushalmi, in the Bavli, he brings them arguments from Midrash Halacha, but their answer is completely different. Whereas in the Talmud Bavli, according to the story, the moment he told them his logical arguments, they accepted him and made him Nasi. In the Yerushalmi, which says this, Amru lo, Kvar amarnu im yesh tohara mi-Bavli. We knew that we could not rely on a Babylonian in a way that we don't accept your arguments. And they tell him, Hekesh she'amarta yesh lo tshuva. Kal v'chomer she'amarta yesh lo tshuva. Gzera shava she'amarta en adam dan gzera shava matzmo. All the arguments that you made can be refuted. Two of them refuted logically. The third one, and that is something we're going to touch upon next week. The third one is your logical deduction, and you cannot make it on your own. You have to have a tradition. So once they got to this argument, here we hear this. This is not only different than the Talmud Bavli, it's the opposite. You realize what happens here? In the Bavli, they said, the moment he presented his logical arguments, they accepted them and they made him Nasi, and he was teaching them all day long. In the Yerushalmi, he was Doresh Kol Hayom, but they were not listening to him. He was trying to convince them, and they wouldn't accept his arguments. Eventually, Acha Marlein Yavo Alai. Yavo Alai is like an oath. I swear that it's true, and if not, I'll be punished. Kach shamati mishmaya v'avtalon. I swear that this is what I heard. Everything I told you, I heard from my rabbis. Kevan sheshamru mimenu ken amdu minu oto nasi alein. So once they heard that, they appointed him to be the nasi, the president of the Bedin. And this story is important to understanding how the rules of the Midrash Halacha evolved, because the way we see it here, they were not accepted by everyone as methods of revealing the original intention of the giver of the law, but rather as tools which could be used by the rabbis as an interpretation, and they might be right, might be wrong. So that is an important distinction that must be made. And even when we study halakha today, I believe we have to go back and examine the Talmudic sugya and ask this question: where are the sources coming from? What is solid? What is tradition? What is a logical process? And I mean, if there is a serious necessity, how far can we go without breaking the tradition? And this is something that we're going to do. So we'll stop here today. We'll continue with this sugya and also the issues of Midrash Halacha next week, God willing. I think